The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a deep hum that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient building. Inside, thousands of alien representatives from across the galaxy had gathered for what many believed would be the most important vote in Council history. The air itself felt heavy with anticipation and barely contained anger. Ambassador Kralthon of the Voltarian Empire stood at the central podium, his 6 arms gesturing dramatically as he held up a glowing data tablet. His voice boomed through the chamber's translation system, reaching every corner of the vast space. Fellow council members, today we address a threat that has grown too large to ignore. Motion 4471B calls for the immediate expulsion of the human species from this honored council. A wave of murmurs rippled through the chamber like water disturbed by a stone. Some delegates nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. In their seats, the humans had only been members of the council for 57 years, a blink of an eye in galactic terms, but their impact had been impossible to ignore. The charges are clear, Kralthon continued, his voice growing stronger. With each word, reckless expansion across 17 star systems without proper authorization, diplomatic violations, including the unauthorized contact with pre-space flight civilizations, and most concerning of all, their destabilizing influence on our carefully maintained galactic order. In the human section of the chamber, Ambassador Duhayan sat perfectly still, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Beside him, his aide Minun furiously scribbled notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing up at the sea of hostile faces surrounding them. The human delegation was small compared to the massive gatherings of other species. Just 12 representatives for all of humanity. Council Speaker Morden is an ancient being whose species had helped found the Council 3,000 years ago, called for the preliminary debate to begin. What followed was a parade of accusations that seemed to grow more heated with each speaker. The crystalline Silkari complained about human mining operations that had disrupted their meditation planets. The gas-welling Nefter protested human atmospheric processors that had changed the composition of their border worlds. They expand like a virus, declared Ambassador Valenix of the Xanthari Republic, her multiple eyes flashing with anger. First 1 system, then 10, then 50. Where does it end? When will they be satisfied? The Bracton war chief. Thrak pounded, his massive fist on his delegation's table, causing several smaller species to jump in their seats. My people have fought for territory for 10,000 years, and even we know when to stop. These humans show no such wisdom. Duhayan watched it all with the calm expression of someone who had expected this moment for years. He had served as humanity's primary ambassador for the past decade, and he had seen the growing resentment building among the other species. Humanity's rapid expansion and technological advancement had made many older civilizations nervous. The preliminary vote was called, and the results appeared on the massive display screens throughout the chamber.
Wow.
The numbers were stark and undeniable. 847 votes in favor of proceeding with the expulsion. Only 23 against, with 156 abstentions. Even some of humanity's supposed allies had voted to move forward with the motion. As the chamber erupted in discussion, Duhayan finally allowed himself a small smile. The other delegates had no idea what they were about to discover. The chamber had barely begun to empty when a figure emerged from the shadows of the ancient archives. Archivist Nexville moved slowly across the polished floor, his aged form supported by a walking staff that had been carved from the heartwood of his homeworld's sacred trees. In his gnarled hands he carried something that made several nearby. Delegates stepped back in surprise. The data crystal was unlike anything most had ever seen. It pulsed with a soft golden light that seemed to come from within its core, and intricate symbols covered its surface in languages so old that only a handful of beings in the galaxy could still read them. Red security bands wrapped around the crystal, each one bearing warning codes that made even seasoned diplomats nervous. Speaker Morden Nexville's voice cracked with age, but it carried an authority that made the entire chamber fall silent. This motion cannot proceed. The speaker's multiple eyes focused on the ancient keeper with obvious irritation. Morden had been looking forward to finally ridding the council of what he saw as the human problem. The preliminary vote had given him exactly the mandate he needed. Archivist, your concerns are noted, but the vote has been called. The council has spoken clearly on this matter. Morden's voice carried the weight of 3 millennia of tradition. Nextville raised the crystal higher. Its glow seemed to intensify. The original charter must be consulted. There are complications that the council must understand before any final action is taken. Several delegates began to grumble among themselves. The Voltarian ambassador who had proposed the motion looked particularly annoyed. They had spent months building support for this expulsion, and now this old keeper was trying to delay their victory with ancient bureaucracy. What complications could possibly justify delaying justice? Demanded Thorak, the Bracton war chief. The humans have violated our laws. They must face the consequences. But Nextville refused to elaborate. His ancient eyes, clouded with age, but still sharp with intelligence, remained fixed on the speaker. The Constitutional Review Committee must examine these documents before any final vote. The charter is clear on this matter. Speaker Morden found himself in an impossible position. The Council's own laws required that any motion affecting fundamental membership had to be reviewed against the original charter if requested by the archivist. It was an old rule, one that hadn't been invoked in over 1,000 years, but it was still binding. The human delegation watched this exchange with growing interest. Ambassador Duhayen leaned forward slightly, his expression remaining neutral, but as aide Mignon noticed that his hands had stopped their nervous fidgeting for the first time all day. "Very well," Morden announced, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The final vote is postponed for 72 hours. The Constitutional Review Committee will convene immediately to examine the documents in question." The chamber erupted in protests. Representatives from dozens of species voiced their anger at the delay. Some accused the humans of orchestrating this interruption, though Duhayen's genuinely surprised expression suggested otherwise. As the crowd began to disperse, Nextville approached. The human delegation. His ancient face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Duhayen's heart race. "Ambassador," the old keeper whispered, "I suggest your people prepare themselves. What we are about to discover will change everything." The Constitutional Review Committee gathered in the deepest levels of the council building, far below the main chamber where tourists and junior diplomats were allowed to visit. The room itself was a marvel of ancient engineering, its walls lined with crystalline storage matrices that hummed with the collected wisdom of 3,000 years of galactic civilization. Juris Kelder had seen many strange things in her long career, but the data crystal that Archivist Nextville placed before the committee made her normally steady hands tremble slightly. The golden light that emanated from within seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat, and the ancient symbols covering its surface shifted and changed as she watched. "Committee members," Kelder began, her voice carefully controlled, "we are here to examine the original charter as it relates to Motion 4471B, the proposed expulsion of humanity from the Council." The other committee members leaned forward as the crystal was placed into the reading device. The machine itself was older than most civilizations. It's built by the Council's founders to decode documents that contained multiple layers of meaning and security protocols. The first documents that appeared on the holographic display were familiar enough. The standard founding principles that every school child across the galaxy learned about: unity, cooperation, peaceful expansion, and mutual respect among species. But as they dug deeper into the Charter's subsections, strange clauses began to emerge. Section 47C, read Committee Member Valenix, squinting at the ancient text. Founding Species Protections. Any civilization that contributed to the establishment of this council shall be granted permanent membership status and cannot be expelled by normal voting procedures. The committee nodded. This was expected. Everyone knew that the original founding species had special protections, though most of those civilizations had gone extinct or evolved beyond recognition over the millennia. But look at this. Kelder pointed to a subsection that seemed to flicker in and out of existence on the display. Section 47C1, Temporal Displacement Protocols. What could that possibly mean? The words on the screen were written in an archaic, a form of galactic standard that predated most modern translation systems. Even with their advanced linguistics programs, the committee struggled to make sense of certain phrases. Retroactive membership provisions, muttered another committee member, Kolmesh from the Silkari Collective. This language is almost incomprehensible. It talks about species that will contribute to the Council's founding, not species that did contribute. The more they read, the more confused they became. The documents seemed to suggest that the Council's founding wasn't a single historical event, but rather something that happened across multiple time periods simultaneously. There were references to temporal contributors and chronologically displaced representatives that made no logical sense. "This is impossible," Valenix declared, her multiple eyes scanning the text repeatedly. "These protocols describe events that haven't happened yet, technologies that don't exist, and membership criteria that violate the basic laws of causality." But the documents were undeniably authentic. The quantum signatures matched the Council's most secure encoding systems, and the crystal itself bore the unmistakable mark of the original founder's technology. As the hours passed, the committee members grew increasingly uncomfortable. It expected to find some minor procedural requirements that would delay the human expulsion by a few days at most. Instead, they were uncovering evidence of something far more complex and disturbing. "We need to call in the temporal physics experts," Kelder finally announced. "Whatever these protocols mean, they're beyond our current understanding of galactic law." None of them noticed that in the human quarter of the Council building, Ambassador Duhayan was pacing his quarters with the expression of someone waiting for a very important phone call. The committee had been working for 18 hours straight. When Valenix made the discovery that would change everything, she had been cross-referencing the signature pages of the original charter, a tedious task that involved comparing thousands of names and symbols from species across the galaxy. Her eyes were tired, and she had consumed enough stimulants to keep a small army awake for a week. "This can't be right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. The other committee members looked up from their own research, noting the strange tone in her voice. On the holographic display in front of her, a single signature glowed with an eerie blue light. The name was written in clear, modern galactic standard, not the archaic script they had been struggling with for hours, but it was the date that made her blood run cold. Committee members Valenix called out, her voice shaking slightly. "You need to see this immediately." Juris Kelder hurried over, followed by the rest of the team. What they saw on the display made them all step back in shock. There, among signatures from the ancient founders of the Council, was a name that shouldn't exist. Duhayan Park, Ambassador of the Terran Federation, representing humanity in the Galactic Council. The signature was dated 2,847 years ago, nearly 3 millennia before humans had supposedly invented the wheel, let alone achieved space travel. "That's impossible," Kolmesh whispered, his crystalline form dimming with confusion. Humans weren't. Even spacefaring, until 57 years ago, their own records showed they were still fighting with primitive weapons on their homeworld when this charter was signed. But Valenix was already pulling up current Council records on her secondary display. With trembling manipulators, she accessed the official signature database for all current ambassadors. When Duhayan Park's signature appeared on the screen, the committee fell into stunned silence. The signatures were identical. It's not similar, not close, but absolutely, perfectly identical, down to the smallest stroke and flourish. The quantum signature analysis confirmed what their eyes were telling them. These were the same signature, made by the same hand, using the same neural patterns and muscle memory. "Run the analysis again," Kelder ordered, her voice barely steady. "There has to be an error in the system." But the analysis came back the same. The signature from 2,847 years ago matched the current human ambassador's signature with 100% accuracy. The probability of this being a coincidence was so astronomically small that the computer couldn't even calculate it. "This violates every known law of physics," Valenix said, staring at the displays in disbelief. How could the same person sign a document nearly 3,000 years before they were born? The committee members looked at each other with growing panic. They had been tasked with reviewing some ancient bureaucratic procedures, not uncovering evidence of what appeared to be time travel. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "We need to verify this immediately," Kelder announced. "Me every piece of documentation we have on human history. I want to know everything about this Duhayan Park, and I want to know it now." As the committee scrambled to gather more information, None of them noticed that they're secure. Communications system had just recorded an incoming message from the human delegation. The message was brief and simple. "We need to talk," the signature. Mystery was just the beginning. What they would discover next would shake the very foundations of galactic civilization and reveal a truth that has been hidden for millennia. The committee room fell into chaos as more impossible evidence emerged. From the ancient archives, what had started as a routine review of membership procedures had transformed into something that challenged everything they thought they knew about galactic history. Kolmesh's crystalline form flickered rapidly as he processed the technical specifications hidden within the charter's appendices. His voice came out in short, broken bursts as he struggled to comprehend what he was reading. "The Universal Translator Protocols," he announced to the room, his usual calm demeanor completely shattered. "Section 12A contains the complete technical blueprints for our translation systems. But look at the notation here." The holographic display showed detailed schematics that were far more advanced than anything the committee had ever seen. The technology that allowed every species in the galaxy to communicate with each other. The foundation of all galactic diplomacy was laid out in perfect detail, contributed by the Terran Federation technical specialist Minyoung Lee. Valenix read aloud, her voice growing smaller with each word. Dated 2,847 years ago. But that wasn't the end of it. As they dug deeper into the charter's technical sections, they found more human contributions that shouldn't exist. There's the faster-than-light communication arrays that connected every council world. The gravitational manipulation systems that allowed massive space stations to exist. Even the quantum encryption protocols that protected the council's most sensitive data. "This is impossible," Kelder whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. The evidence was right there in front of them, authenticated by quantum signatures. That couldn't be forged. The committee members began pulling up historical records on their personal displays, searching for any mention of these technologies' origins. What they found made their situation even more disturbing. According to our official histories, Valenix announced, the Universal Translator was developed by the Silkari Collective 2,200 years ago. The FTL communication system was invented by the Zenthari Republic 1,800 years ago. But these documents show that both technologies were fully developed and integrated into the Council's founding structure 2,847 years ago. The implications hit them like a physical blow. Their entire understanding of galactic history was built on a lie. The technologies that had allowed their civilizations to flourish, the systems that had prevented countless wars and enabled peaceful expansion across the galaxy had all come from humans who had somehow traveled back in time. "We need to understand the scope of this," Kelder said, her voice steadier now as her legal training kicked in. "How much of our civilization is built on human contributions that haven't been invented yet?" The answer, as they soon discovered, was everything. The Council's governmental structure, its legal framework, its peacekeeping protocols. Even the architectural design of the Council building itself all bore the unmistakable mark of human innovation from the future. "Look at this," Kolmesh called out, his form now pulsing with agitation. "The peaceful expansion doctrine that has governed galactic colonization for 3 millennia. It's signed by someone named Hejin Kim, identified as a human diplomat specializing in interspecies relations." The committee stared at the document in stunned silence. The peaceful expansion doctrine had prevented more wars than any other single piece of legislation in galactic history. It had been the cornerstone of Council policy since its founding. "We're not just looking at time travel," Valenix finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're looking at the complete reconstruction of galactic history by humans from the future. Everything we are, everything we've built, everything we believe about our own civilization's achievements, has been guided by human intervention from a timeline that doesn't exist yet." The emergency session was called at dawn. Just as the first light of the Council world's twin suns began to filter through the ancient chamber's crystalline windows, Speaker Morden had barely slept, his mind reeling from the Constitutional Review Committee's impossible findings. The evidence was spread across his personal display screens like pieces of a puzzle that defied all logic. Ambassador, Duhayen entered the private chamber with the calm, measured steps of someone who had been expecting this moment for years. His aide Minyoung followed close behind, carrying a small device that none of the council members recognized. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Ambassador Park Morden began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 millennia of authority. We have discovered some very disturbing inconsistencies in our founding documents. Duhayen took his seat across from the speaker, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. I imagine you have questions. Questions? Morden's voice rose an octave. Ambassador, your signature appears on documents that are nearly 3,000 years old. Documents that were signed before your species had even discovered fire, according to your own historical records. The other council members present leaned forward, waiting for the human to provide some rational explanation. Perhaps it was a clerical error, or a case of mistaken identity. Surely there had to be some logical reason for what they had found. Duhayen was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly around the room, taking in each face. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and tinged with what sounded like sadness. No, there's no mistake. I am indeed the same Duhayen Park who signed the original charter 2,847 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Several council members exchanged glances, clearly wondering if the human had suffered some kind of mental breakdown under the pressure of the impending expulsion vote. That's impossible, Morden stated flatly. Humans live for barely a century. Even with advanced medical technology, you couldn't possibly be thousands of years old. Duhayen reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, glowing device that seemed to bend light around itself. The technology was unlike anything the council members had ever seen, and its very presence seemed to make the air in the room feel strange and heavy. Not thousands of years old, he said quietly. I traveled back in time using this. He placed the device on the table between them. Temporal displacement technology. We developed it in the year 2387, in my original timeline. The council members stared at the device with a mixture of fear and fascination. Morden's multiple eyes focused on the human with growing alarm. Why? The speaker demanded. Why would you do such a thing? Duhayen's expression grew darker, and for the first time since entering the chamber, his composure cracked slightly, because in my original timeline, the galaxy was dying. Wow. The council never existed. Without proper guidance, our civilizations destroyed each other in a series of wars that lasted for centuries. He activated the device, and holographic images began to appear above the table. The council members gasped as they saw worlds burning, entire species extinct, and space filled with the debris of countless battles. This is what the galaxy looked like in my time, Duhayen continued, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible memories. Billions dead. Entire solar systems reduced to ash. Civilizations that had existed for millennia wiped out in a matter of decades. The images shifted, showing the few remaining survivors huddled on barren worlds, their technologies lost, their cultures forgotten. So we made a choice, Duhayen said, his tired eyes meeting each council member's gaze. We decided to go back and prevent it all from happening. The revelation hit the council members like a physical blow, but the full horror of their situation didn't become clear until Juris Kelder began working through the logical implications. She had always been known for her methodical approach to complex legal problems, but this challenge was unlike anything she had ever faced. If what Ambassador Duhayen is telling us is true, she began, her voice carefully controlled, then we have a serious problem, a problem that goes far beyond simple membership disputes. The emergency session had expanded to include the full Constitutional Review Committee, and the room was packed with some of the galaxy's most brilliant legal minds. But none of them had ever dealt with the paradoxes created by time travel. Explain it to us simply, Speaker Morden demanded, his patience wearing thin after hours of revelations that defied everything he thought he knew. About reality, Kelder activated a holographic display that showed a timeline stretching back thousands of years. According to our historical records, the Council was founded 2,847 years ago by 7 ancient species working together to create a peaceful galactic civilization. But the evidence we've discovered shows that this founding was actually guided by humans from our future. She pointed to various events along the timeline, each one glowing with a soft blue light. The universal translator that allows us to communicate. The faster-than-light communication networks that connect our worlds. The peaceful expansion doctrine that has prevented countless wars. The gravitational manipulation technology that allows our space stations to exist. All of these innovations came from human time travelers. The committee members stared at the display in growing horror as the implications became clear. Kelder continued, "Imagine what happens if we expel humanity from the Council. In our timeline, humans would never develop the advanced technology needed for time travel. They would never go back to help found the Council. But if the Council was never properly founded," she touched a control, and the timeline began to shift and change. The blue lights representing human contributions began to flicker and fade. Without the human contributions, the Council would never have developed the technologies and policies that made galactic peace possible. The 7 founding species would have struggled to create a stable government. Wars would have broken out. Civilizations would have collapsed. The timeline on the display grew darker and more chaotic as the human contributions disappeared. Entire sections of galactic history began to unravel. "But here's the truly terrifying part," Kelder said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Council fails to maintain galactic peace. Then the conditions that led humans to develop time travel in the first place would never occur. The timeline that Duhayon came from would cease to exist." Committee member Valnex leaned forward, her multiple eyes wide with fear. "You're saying that expelling humanity would erase the very timeline that created the Council in the first place?" "Exactly," Kelder replied. "We would create a paradox that could unravel the entire fabric of galactic history. The Council wouldn't just lose its human members, it would cease to exist entirely." The room fell silent as the full weight of the situation settled over them. They weren't just dealing with a membership dispute anymore. They were looking at the potential collapse of galactic civilization itself. "There's more," Kelder continued reluctantly. "If the Council ceases to exist, then the peaceful expansion that has characterized the last 3 millennia would never happen. The wars that Duhayon described, the ones that destroyed his original timeline, would become inevitable." Speaker Morden's hands shook as he processed the information. "You're telling us that we're trapped in a causal loop. We can't expel humanity because doing so would destroy the very foundations of our civilization." "That's correct," Kelder confirmed. "Humanity isn't just a member of the Council, they're the cornerstone that holds our entire reality together." The news spread through the Council building like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and encrypted messages that somehow found their way to every delegation. Within hours, what had been a closely guarded secret known only to the Constitutional Review Committee was being discussed in hushed tones throughout the massive structure. Ambassador Thon of the Voltarian Empire was the first to demand answers. He burst into the committee chambers with his usual dramatic flair, his 6 arms gesturing wildly as he spoke. "This cannot be true," he declared, his voice echoing off the crystalline walls. "My people have built the greatest commercial empire in galactic history through our own strength and wisdom. We owe nothing to these primitive humans." But Juris Kelder was ready for him. She had spent the last several hours cross-referencing the human contributions with the major events in Voltarian history. What she found painted a very different picture than the one Kralthon wanted to believe. "The Voltarian Trade Expansion Act of 2,234 years ago," she announced, pulling up the relevant documents on her holographic display. "The legislation that allowed your species to establish peaceful trading relationships with 17 different civilizations. Do you know who wrote the framework for that act?" Kralthon's confident expression began to falter as he read the name on the document. Hai-Jin Kim. Human Diplomatic Specialist, Temporal Division. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "That act was written by our greatest legal minds. It's taught in every Voltarian school as an example of our diplomatic genius. The framework was provided by human time travelers. Kelder continued relentlessly. Without their intervention, your species would have continued. Their aggressive expansion patterns that had already led to conflicts with 3 neighboring civilizations. The humans didn't just help you avoid those wars. They helped you create the trading empire that made your species wealthy. The truth was even more devastating when War Chief Thurak of the Bracton arrived, his massive frame filling the doorway. As he demanded to know what was happening, the Bracton were proud warriors who had dominated their sector of the galaxy for centuries before voluntarily joining the Council. My people conquered 17 worlds before we chose to join your peaceful alliance, Thurak boomed. We were never defeated in battle. We joined the Council because we decided we wanted peace. But the records told a different story. The committee had found detailed reports of human temporal agents who had carefully orchestrated the events that led to the Bracton-S integration into galactic society. The Battle of Kethmer, Kelder said quietly, your species' greatest military victory. Yet. The one that convinced you that you were strong enough to choose peace instead of conquest. Do you want to know what really happened? Thurak's expression grew dangerous, but he nodded curtly. Human agents provided critical intelligence to your enemies, ensuring that the battle would be just difficult enough to satisfy your warrior culture while still allowing you to win. They also arranged for several key Bracton leaders to witness the aftermath, the civilian casualties, the destroyed cities, the horror that your leaders felt after that victory, the moment they decided that conquest wasn't worth the cost. That was carefully planned by human psychologists from the future. The war chief's massive fists clenched, but he remained silent. The pride of his entire species was built on what now appeared to be an elaborate deception. As more species representatives arrived, the pattern became clear. The Silkari Collective's spiritual awakening that had led them to become the galaxy's most respected mediators. The Zenthari Republic's legal innovations that had become the foundation of galactic law. The Nephter-S atmospheric processing techniques that had made dozens of worlds habitable. Every major achievement, every moment of progress, every step toward galactic peace had been quietly guided by human hands from a future that shouldn't exist. The Great Council Chamber had never seen anything like it. Representatives from across the galaxy sat in stunned silence as Speaker Morden officially withdrew Motion 4471B from consideration. The holographic display that had shown the overwhelming support for human expulsion just days earlier now displayed a simple message: motion withdrawn, constitutional issues. But everyone in the chamber knew the real reason. The whispered conversations, the leaked documents, and the emergency briefings had spread the impossible truth throughout the council. Humanity wasn't just another member species that could be voted out when they became inconvenient. They were the invisible architects of galactic civilization itself. Ambassador Duhayan stood at the central podium, looking older than his apparent years. The weight of carrying such a monumental secret for decades had clearly taken its toll. His aide Minyoung stood beside him, her expression mixing relief with exhaustion. Honored representatives, Duhayan began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. I know that recent revelations have been difficult to process. You have questions, and you deserve answers. The chamber remained eerily quiet. These beings who had been calling for humanity's expulsion just days before now looked at the human delegation with a mixture of awe, fear, and resentment. The temporal loop that currently maintains our timeline is not permanent, Duhayan continued. In approximately 237 years, humanity will naturally develop the technology that allowed us to travel back and help establish the Council. When that happens, the loop will complete itself, and the timeline will become stable and linear. War Chief Thurak of the Bracton was the first to speak. His massive frame seemed somehow smaller than before, as if the revelation of human manipulation had deflated his warrior pride. What happens to us then? When your loop completes, do we simply cease to exist? Duhayan's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine compassion. No, the timeline will stabilize, not disappear. Everything that has happened, all the progress your civilizations have made, all the peace we've achieved together, it will all become permanent and natural. The only difference will be that the causal loop will no longer be necessary. Ambassador Kralthon stood up, his 6 arms, trembling slightly, but until then, we're trapped. We cannot act against humanity without destroying ourselves. That's correct, Duhayan admitted. Any action taken against humanity that prevents us from eventually developing temporal technology would unravel the entire timeline. The Council, the peace treaties, the technological innovations that have prevented countless wars, all of it depends on maintaining the current trajectory. The implications were staggering. An entire galaxy of civilizations, some of which had existed for tens of thousands of years, had discovered that their recent history was dependent on a species that had only achieved spaceflight 57 years ago. Speaker Morden's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. The Council must vote on humanity's status, given the unique circumstances. I propose granting humanity permanent protected status within the Council structure. The vote was, unlike any in Council history, representatives who had been demanding human expulsion just days before now found themselves legally and practically required to protect the species they had tried to remove. The final tally was unanimous: 1,026 votes in favor, 0 against, 0 abstentions. As the results appeared on the display screens, Duhayan allowed himself a small smile. Thank you. I know this isn't easy for any of you. But I want you to know that in my original timeline, the one where everything went wrong, I had the privilege of knowing many of your species. You are all capable of incredible things with ore. Without our intervention, the chamber began to empty slowly, representatives returning to their quarters to process what they had learned. The galaxy they thought they knew had been revealed as something far more complex and fragile than anyone had imagined. As the last delegates filed out, Minyoung approached her ambassador. Sir, do you think they'll ever forgive us for this deception? Duhayan looked around the empty chamber, his eyes reflecting the weight of nearly 3 millennia of hidden truth. In 237 years, when the timeline becomes natural and the loop completes, I don't think forgiveness will be necessary. They'll simply remember us as the species that helped them build something beautiful.